Good evening, everyone. My name's Jim Ryan. I'm the Dean of the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to tonight's very special Askwith Forum. It is special because it's not every day that we have the privilege of hosting the sitting president of one of the world's greatest universities, the University of Virginia. UVA, as you may know, is an intellectual powerhouse of an institution, one where the highly influential scholarly contributions of its faculty and remarkable energy and academic achievements of its students are matched only by its athletic prowess and major historical significance. Did I mention that I'm an alum of UVA? In case you can't tell already, I'm especially pleased and proud to welcome Teresa A. Sullivan, the president of the University of Virginia and also the George M. Kaufman Presidential Professor of Sociology. She is going to speak for about 30 minutes, and then she is going to have a conversation with Judy McLaughlin, Senior Lecturer of Education here at HGSE, and herself an expert in higher education leadership. But first, a few more words about President Sullivan. Here at HGSE, we talk a fair bit about leadership, the importance of leadership, and how critical leaders are, because every education leader has the potential to touch the lives of thousands of students and teachers. President Sullivan is a perfect example. She oversees a university of more than 20,000 students, 2,000 faculty, 10,000 full-time staff, and more than 220,000 alumni. That's in addition to managing a budget of $2.7 billion and a major medical center. I should add as well that when she first arrived at UVA in 2010 from the University of Michigan, where she served as provost and executive vice president for academic affairs, she walked into the middle of a $3 billion capital campaign, which she successfully completed in 2013. Having myself stepped into the middle of a capital campaign when I began, I'm both sympathetic and envious of President Sullivan's completed task. Beyond bringing this campaign, her campaign, to a successful close, President Sullivan has accomplished a great deal in a short period of time. She spearheaded a major university-wide strategic planning effort called the Cornerstone Plan, which gathered and made sense of input from more than 10,000 alums, parents, students, faculty, staff, and other stakeholders. She has developed a new financial model for the university in order to promote economic stability, transparency, and innovation. She has improved faculty compensation and student affordability and has encouraged hybrid and online learning, all in a time of declining state revenues for public higher education. She has recognized quite rightly that, and I quote, "The greatest challenge facing higher education today is the need to balance two equally important and equally demanding obligations: to sustain academic excellence while ensuring that a college education remains affordable for students from all financial backgrounds." In response to that challenge, UVA, under President Sullivan's leadership, has just launched a new program called Affordable Excellence, which is a commitment to students and families to offer a world-class education that is accessible to all. What makes these accomplishments all the more remarkable is that she has faced, by any account, an unusual number of high-profile challenges that have been widely reported in the media, and some reported far less accurately than others, unfortunately. But like they say, it's not what happens that matters as much as how you respond to what happens. And President Sullivan has used these challenges as opportunities to take on some of the toughest issues that face not just UVA, but college campuses across the country. She has been rightly admired for her work with student leaders to develop a new code of conduct and new rules about fraternity and sorority life, and she is working tirelessly to make UVA a leader in addressing sexual assault on campus, again an issue that every campus confronts. Because of how President Sullivan has responded to these various events, I wholeheartedly agree with her letter to UVA students this past December, when she wrote that, "As challenging a time as it has been, I believe that this fall will be remembered not for how we dwelled in darkness, but for how we turned to light." And I believe that's exactly how I picture President Sullivan. It's my great honor as a UVA Law School alum, former faculty member, and diehard UVA basketball fan to host and welcome President Sullivan here at HGSE. Please join me now in welcoming her. and welcoming Judy McLaughlin as well. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Jim. It's a great honor to come to Harvard University to speak at the distinguished Askwith Forum, and I'm grateful to Dean Ryan and Judy and their colleagues here in the Graduate School of Education for inviting me, and thank you all for coming. I know that Jim is a UVA alum. Are there any other alumni in the room? Oh, great, wahoo-wah. And I also want to acknowledge Dan Myers, who's sitting here in the front row as the member of our Finance Committee and has been involved on the foundation board for our Curry School of Education for some 20 years now. So thank you for coming too, Dan. So my remarks are going to be divided into two parts. I'm going to spend some time talking about the challenges that higher education leaders face during this period of rapid change and innovation in our industry. But then I'm going to talk about some principles of effective leadership that I developed in my over 30 years in higher education, principles that I think can help navigate the challenges we face, not just in universities, but in other organizations too. So I want to begin with a story about teaching, research, and espionage. Not too long ago, a disturbing news article ran in Bloomberg News under the headline, "American Universities Infected by Foreign Spies." The article revealed that in recent years, intelligence operatives, mostly from East Asia and the Middle East, have been attempting to obtain classified information from our universities by asking to review academic papers or to work with professors under the guise of collaboration, sometimes to come to the university at the expense of their government for the opportunity to continue their own education. The threat became so significant that the FBI's counterintelligence unit issued a white paper to make college administrators and researchers aware of the attacks. According to the FBI, attempts from East Asia increased 8-fold over a one-year period, and attempts from the Middle East doubled in the same amount of time. In one instance, the hosts of an international conference invited an American researcher to submit a paper, and while she gave her talk at the conference, they hooked a thumb drive to her laptop and downloaded all of her files. Well, they say that imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, and if that's true, America's universities should be extremely flattered and perhaps alarmed by all the attention from foreign operatives. But if you follow the national discussion about higher education in this country, and I know that you do, you recognize a vein of irony running through this story. At a moment when foreign countries are racing to imitate our research universities because they see them as models of excellence, and when some foreign countries are even dispatching spies to steal our ideas, higher education here at home is challenged, criticized, and in some cases, openly attacked. These challenges include the progressive erosion of state and federal funding for universities, greater scrutiny from regulatory agencies, a sharpened focus on efficiency and productivity, increasing demands to control costs and ensure affordability for students and their families, the question of how to use new technologies and how to avoid misusing them, and so on. For many schools, the greatest challenges are financial. Last month in Virginia, officials announced the closing of Sweetbriar College, a century-old liberal arts college for women. When making the decision to close, Sweetbriar leaders cited insurmountable financial challenges. Alumni, faculty, and students are now waging a valiant campaign to try to save the college. Time will tell whether they can succeed. But while this story received a lot of national publicity, very quietly, 2 other private colleges in Virginia have closed in the last 2 years, also for financial reasons. But the challenges are not just financial. In our national discourse, the most fundamental values of higher learning are being called into question. Among these are the value of a liberal arts degree, the value of liberal arts at all in a high-tech economy, whether it's worth it to go to college, the value of basic research, and even the long-held belief that higher education is an essential instrument of the public good. These and other challenges are putting many of America's colleges and universities under intense pressure. But they also present us with a golden opportunity to redefine higher education for the 21st century, to enhance our traditional pedagogy with new methods of teaching, using new technologies, to develop new and more efficient business models for our universities while sustaining academic excellence, to become more accountable for the quality of education we are providing to our students, and to preserve a social contract that says a college education should be affordable for every student who is academically qualified. Accomplishing these things in tumultuous times requires strong leadership. In a few moments, I'll describe some principles of effective leadership that might help us meet these challenges. But first, I want to talk about a different type of challenge, the one that we never see coming. Most of the challenges I've described so far, financial pressure, regulatory scrutiny, and so on, they form slowly over time, and we've been able to see them coming across the horizon and to prepare for them. But colleges and universities also face the challenges that come from unexpected crises. The 2011 child sex abuse crisis at Penn State and the 2007 mass murder at Virginia Tech are two well-known examples of criminal acts that shook those communities to their cores, exacerbated by the glare of the national media attention. We're no strangers to crisis at the University of Virginia. Last November, a crisis erupted with the publication of a Rolling Stone article that depicted a horrific attack in one of our fraternity houses. The article piled trauma on trauma at UVA because it was published only a few weeks after the highly publicized disappearance and murder of one of our students. More recently, there was an incident involving one of our current students who was injured when agents of Virginia's Department of Alcohol Beverage Control were attempting to take him into custody outside of a local pub. That incident also attracted national media, and an independent investigation by Virginia State Police is now underway. The Rolling Stone article eventually unraveled. The details were discredited. The Columbia Journalism Review placed Rolling Stone at the top of its list for the worst journalism of 2014. And last month, after a 4-month investigation, Charlottesville police concluded there was no evidence to support the allegations in the story. But each one of these incidents thrust our university into the national spotlight and required immediate action. When crises such as these arise in our organizations, the stress is compounded by the pressure of the 24/7 news cycle and the demand for immediate responses, often before we have all of the facts fully in hand. The pressure is further increased by the fact that in universities, there is so much we simply cannot talk about because of FERPA laws and other restrictions. In situations such as these, crisis management and crisis communications play out differently at a public versus a private university for several reasons. For one thing, private university boards are permitted to meet for discussions behind closed doors. And private universities are not subject to Freedom of Information Act requests from journalists and other inquiring minds. And this discrepancy raises a deeper question. Are private universities really private at all? Well, yes and no. Private universities are truly private in the sense of having the benefit of the privacies I just mentioned, and in the sense that they aren't controlled by state governments. But private universities also have some fairly obvious public characteristics. They receive public subsidies, mostly in the form of tax breaks, tax deductions, student loans and grants, and of course, faculty research grants. Donors who make gifts to build large endowments in private universities get a tax exemption for their gifts. The federal government provides need-based financial aid for students in private universities. Private research universities, just like public research universities, receive government grants and contracts that allow overhead to cover a portion of the research costs. These are public, taxpayer-based subsidies. Private universities reap the benefit of these public subsidies, but without enduring the public scrutiny that public universities do. And this can make a difference during a crisis and its aftermath. Although the Rolling Stones story unraveled, at UVA we are using our moment in the national spotlight to lead the way in developing solutions to a real and persistent problem. Sexual violence is an issue in all colleges, in the military, and in many workplaces. Finding meaningful solutions will require ingenuity and energy. It will require creativity and candor. And above all, it will require strong leadership. And that brings me to the second part of my remarks. The essential ingredient for meeting the numerous challenges we face in higher education will be strong leadership. This is true for both our long-term challenges and the short-term crises that will inevitably flare up from time to time. So let me turn now to some principles of effective leadership. Let's start by acknowledging that the word leadership means different things to different people. When we speak of leadership, what we often mean is heroic leadership. These are the leaders who step forward in a crisis and sometimes through the sheer force of personality save the situation. The role of the team behind the heroic leader may be forgotten because it's so dramatically clear that it was the hero who saved the day. There is much to admire in the heroic leader. This is a person who is single-minded and forceful in resolving a crisis, sometimes at great personal risk to reputation or even to life. Think of George Washington in the Revolutionary War. Who else could have led that ragtag Continental Army to the improbable victory over the world's undisputed military superpower, the British? Heroic leaders often defy long odds to pull off unlikely triumphs, and we tend to idolize them for that reason. On the other hand, if heroic leadership is our only definition of leadership, then many of us will exclude ourselves from the ranks of leaders. Few of us consider ourselves to be a hero in the grand sense of the word. But fortunately, being a hero is not the only way to be a leader. There are also what I call sustainable leaders. This type of leader works together in a collaborative style, builds value for the long haul, and puts in place the systems and culture to ensure an organization's long-run success. Sustainable leaders are likely to think of the entire team. Who constitutes the team? What kind of training each team member gets? Which members of the team can take on more responsibility? And how the team can function even if one or more members leave. Sustainable leaders build a durable system. While charismatic hero leaders may appear within the system, the sustainable leader is trying to build a deep bench so the entire organization does not rely on the personality of a single individual. Both of these styles of leadership have their advantages, and both also have their dangers. The danger for the sustainable leader is that he or she may fade into the woodwork simply because his or her teams function so effectively. The sustainable leader may be overlooked, underestimated, or even assumed not to be leading because his or her leadership is so understated. On the other hand, there's also a danger for the heroic leader. The heroic leader can begin to suffer from an addiction to crisis, so that if no crisis is going on, the hero might create one just to enjoy the adrenaline rush that comes from saving the day. These two leadership styles are not mutually exclusive. Although George Washington's heroic leadership is perhaps more glamorous and more likely to be the topic of a textbook, he was also a sustainable leader. He turned down the opportunity to be king And he also turned down the opportunity to be president for life because he realized that a peaceful transition of power would help to create stability in the new republic. That refusal to become the permanent executive was a decision about what today we would call succession management. He knew that the generation of the American founders would pass away and that new leaders would have to come from the next generation. So as the example of George Washington shows, leaders can work in both the heroic mode and the sustainable mode when necessary. And sometimes the demands of our jobs require us to work in both modes, sometimes in the course of one day, sometimes in the course of one meeting. And of course, there are more than these two styles of leadership. Some leaders have an authoritative style and rely on their powers of persuasion and enforcement to gather support. Others prefer to lead quietly. Some leaders give continuous advice and coaching to the people who report to them. Others prefer to lead by example. Many leaders blend these and other styles, often depending on the situation at hand. But the point I want to make is that leadership is complex and multifaceted and not the prerogative of one personality type or a single management style or a specific type of background or training. Whether you consider yourself to be a heroic leader, a sustainable leader, or some completely different type of leader, there are principles of effective leadership that I think transcend style and personality type. So these are some of the concepts that I'll talk about for the next several minutes. Here is the first concept. Know your mission. Developing and embracing a clear sense of mission is one of the first steps toward effective leadership. And let me assure you, that's one of the things that gets you through the crises. At UVA, as at many other public universities, we know that being public is about more than where our money comes from. Being public is fundamental to our mission, providing excellent, affordable education to our students, providing exceptional clinical care to citizens from Virginia and beyond who are our patients, conducting research that benefits people in the Commonwealth and around the world. Those are the core elements of our mission as a public university. If we know our mission, we can avoid straying from it. Another step is to communicate the mission to your colleagues and to your external audiences. Not all leaders are effective communicators, but good leaders are. And you must live your mission day in and day out. You let it guide your thinking and your actions. You let it inform the decisions you make and the priorities that you set. Not just the priorities for a 2 or 3 year period or for a semester, but the priorities for today. Knowing your mission helps you make thoughtful decisions about the actions you should take and sometimes the actions you should not take. Having a broadly embraced mission is like having a compass. It keeps you and everyone on the team pointed in the right direction. And here's the second concept. Know the difference between what's urgent and what's important. That's related to knowing your mission because your mission is always important. But urgent matters and crises will come and go. Every day we balance matters of urgency with matters of importance. Crises require this balancing act. We have to stay focused on the long-term important matters even while we contend with the urgent matters that demand immediate attention. And we have to find a way not to let the important things suffer because of the urgent things. Leaders who have a hands-on style sometimes want to keep the urgent matters to themselves until they have fully resolved the issues. From a leadership position, we need to share urgent items with our capable colleagues because we have to keep our eyes on what's important. And here's another concept. Try to become aware of your blind spots. In other words, you need to understand what you don't know, except that you can't possibly know everything about your school or organization, and encourage your colleagues to help you fill in the gaps. Former U.S. Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld had a distinctive way with words, and he once put the blind spot concept this way. There are known knowns. There are things that we know that we know. We also know that there are known unknowns. That is to say, there are some things we do not know. But there are also unknown unknowns. And these are the ones that we don't know that we don't know. It's a bit of a tongue twister, but he makes an important point. Our greatest jeopardies may be the ones we don't even know about. So when I came from Michigan to begin work as UVA's president, I was aware I did not know many things about the Commonwealth of Virginia, the university, and its people, culture, and traditions. Like Mr. Rumsfeld, I knew that I might face unknown unknowns. I am not an alumna of the university because when I graduated from high school, the University of Virginia did not accept women into its undergraduate program. And that means that all the alumni my age or older are exclusively male. So I asked my vice presidents and deans and staff to help me watch out for landmines and to bring bad news to me before it becomes worse news. And that is maybe the hardest thing to persuade people in an organization to do. It is to tell you about what is going wrong. And in exchange for this favor, I promise that I will never shoot the messenger. I'll tell you a story about my first meeting with the vice presidents at the University of Virginia. I had just been named president, but I would not actually come for 8 months. I met with them, and they were a very quiet bunch. Notably, they all studied the table as if it had become really interesting. Their eyes didn't meet mine. And I understood something of this dynamic. I succeeded a popular 20-year president in John Castine. They were all John's appointees. They didn't know if I would ask them to stay on or if I would ask them to leave. They had no idea who I was. They had not met me before. And so, to lighten the mood a little bit, I said, let me tell you about Sullivan's 3 laws of administration. By the way, when I came to the University of Michigan, that was how I started talking with the provost staff, where I experienced the very same phenomenon. I said, first of all, the first principle is never surprise an administrator. And now I find that people will call me and say, Sullivan's first. That means I'm about to tell you some bad news. And that's okay, because the corollary is I will never shoot the messenger who brings me the bad news. The second principle is find all the resources and get appropriate controls over them. Many administrators underestimate the resources they have available because they think of resources in purely financial terms. In fact, I view the most valuable resource of the University of Virginia as the time of the faculty. If I fritter that time away in useless committee work that leads to nothing, I waste the most valuable resource of the university. So it's important for me and my vice presidents to understand what are those resources and to what extent do we deploy them most effectively. And the third was don't leave the important stakeholders out of the conversation. You may remember the Disney depiction of Sleeping Beauty, in which all the witches were invited to the christening party except the one witch who was left out, and that was the one who placed the curse on the princess. So avoid the curse and be sure you have every stakeholder present at the table. If all these things happen, it leads inevitably to the next thing that I think is important, which is creating a culture of leadership in your organization at every level. We need to have cultures in which colleagues feel empowered so they can take action when action's needed and so they can bring bad news forward without fear of reprisal. Those of us in leadership positions are often insulated from the day-to-day activities of the organization. The people on the front lines are much closer to the action, and they sometimes see things the leaders may be missing. This morning I was on grounds and we were welcoming a number of admitted students to one of our welcome programs called Days on the Lawn. And I stopped to talk with some of our staff members who had met the parents at the garage where they were parking. And they said to me, a couple of parents asked me about this or that issue. That is immensely valuable information for me because I was about to go in and talk to those parents. And I knew some of the things that were on their mind because I had talked with these staff members who were literally on the front lines this morning. If we create a culture of leadership that permeates every level of the organization, then people at every level will not hesitate to speak up when there's a problem or to act when action's required. Finally, I want to say something about my earlier remarks about managing a crisis. And instead of offering guidance, this principle raises a question. What should we do if we don't have time to rely on all the other principles? What if a crisis flares up and we don't have time to reflect on our mission or confer with our colleagues? What if we are forced to make instantaneous decisions as a crisis unfolds before our eyes? So my final advice for those moments of crisis is to rely on your values. The human values that tell us the right thing and the ethical thing, and not the most popular thing or the most expedient thing. The values that compel us to act with compassion and not with cold calculation. The values that we share as educators and leaders to pursue the truth wherever it leads. If we have the right values, and if we live those values consistently, then the right leadership decisions will come. I began with a story about espionage. I'm going to close with a story about stargazing. This story holds a lesson for all of us as we consider the challenges and opportunities we face in higher education. The British historian Alan Chapman recently published a book titled Stargazers: Copernicus, Galileo, the Telescope, and the Church. The book gives a fascinating account of how astronomers mapped the stars and other celestial bodies in the period between 1500 and 1700. The development of new technologies was essential to this star mapping process. In the late 16th century, through advancements in optics and new understanding of the manipulation of light, inventors were able to dramatically improve the technology for magnification. And this produced two of the most radical and useful inventions in human history, the microscope and the telescope. Coming into use almost simultaneously, these two instruments opened up two domains to human examination that had always been hidden: the telescopic domain of the vast universe and the stars and planets that inhabit it, and the microscopic domain of very tiny things, including the workings of small organisms. For the first time, scientists could gaze far outward into the unexplored depths of the universe, but they could also gaze deeply inward to scrutinize the innermost essence of things. Galileo was among the first to use a telescope as an instrument for astronomy, but he also pioneered early use of the microscope for the study of organisms. This serves as a suitable closing metaphor for all of us, because in a period of accelerating change, tough challenges, and crisis in higher education, we must do something similar. To address the challenges we face with sincerity and candor, we must look deep within ourselves and affirm our commitments to the values we espouse. At the same time, we must look bravely outward to make the most of the opportunities and discoveries offered to us in this global century. Like Galileo, with a microscope in one hand and a telescope in the other, we must look both deep within and far beyond. Our inspiration to be strong leaders lies in both of those domains. I look forward to your questions.
When she was just starting her presidency in 2010, and to listen to her and think with her a little bit earlier and now today, I see in you both someone who I think all of us would see as both a heroic leader and a sustainable leader. So that's really wonderful. What we're going to do is I'm going to have a conversation. We're going to talk back and forth for a little while, and then we're going to bring you into the conversation. So I get the first opportunity to ask the many things that I'm curious about and want to know about, but then we're going to bring all of you into this. So keep your questions in your mind, and maybe new ones will emerge as we talk. So So actually, I'm going to go back to 2010 because you began at UVA, as you said, following a very long-term president. And everybody knows in higher education that when you follow somebody who's been there a long time, there is both well-established patterns of behavior, default that people just go to, and there's also often a pent-up desire for change, which you find as well. Your predecessor was an alum of three
Yes.
times, and as you said, you weren't an alum, couldn't have been an alum, and you were the first woman, and you were a non-Virginian, and the first non-Virginian, I remember. So that's a lot of change. When you came in, how much did you feel those different pieces of it? You know, presidents enter a sort of field of projections. Everybody's looking at you and seeing in you different kinds of things. What of those mattered at the beginning? What of those matter now, if any?
So I'm in the generation of academics where I was always in a position to be the first woman to do something. That was not new for me. When I comb my hair in the morning, the glass falls out. So I was the first woman to be to serve as a tenured member of my sociology department at Texas. I was the first woman to be full professor, the first woman to be chair, the first woman to be the graduate dean, so on and so forth. So I was used to that. And I had also had the experience of entering a new environment that I hadn't known before, so that I knew all the things you had to look out for. When I was recruited to be provost at the University of Michigan, I actually was very happy at Texas, and I agreed to the recruitment simply because I thought it would be kind of a lark, you know, to be in front of a recruiting committee instead of being the one asking the questions. I thought there was no chance in the world that Michigan would pick me as provost. First of all, they had a woman as president. I didn't think they'd want to have another woman as provost. Secondly, you know, I certainly hadn't gone to Michigan. It was worse than that. I went to Michigan State.
That's right.
And third, Michigan hadn't hired a provost from outside its own faculty since 1948. So I figured it was the most unlikely thing in the world that I would get selected as provost, and I was hugely amazed when I was. But I knew that I faced all these same issues. In fact, the Michigan Daily editorialized against my selection on the premise that somebody from the outside could never understand an institution as complicated as the University of Michigan. But one thing that those of us in the university tend to be is we're master learners. And we can map out a way that we can learn something. And so I had to do that at Michigan. I knew I would have to do that again at Virginia.
Do I recall that when you left, they also had an editorial against you, except it was against your leaving?
Yes, that's correct.
That was a turnaround. Does the fact, there are plenty of women here, does the fact that you're a woman now in any way, is this still a sort of noteworthy in the state, or is it not it obviously is not experience for you, but for others?
I think that it does still make a difference for a lot of people. There have been older male alumni who have come to me and said, you know, I didn't think a woman could ever run this university, but I've changed my mind. And that's been reaffirming to me. There have been any number of Virginia women who have run up to me and hugged me and said, I'm so glad, I'm so glad. They don't even have to say the rest of it. I know what they're talking about. And a lot of parents say to me that they are happy that I'm there because I've been a role model for their daughters. And they worried that their daughters didn't otherwise have a lot of role models. But you know, the one thing I want to say to all of you who are still students is this is all rapidly changing. You know, the things that my generation went through, being the first woman to do that and the first woman to do some other thing, that's much less likely to be an issue, I think, in the future. That's one of the good ways I see social change working in the United States.
So when you left here in 2010 and went to UVA, certainly everybody knew that public education was challenged. And we've talked about those.
Right.
The number of challenges, as you've said, that you faced were certainly, maybe you wouldn't have left Cambridge, you would have headed back to Michigan if you could have predicted those, but you couldn't have foreseen those. Let me talk a little bit about one challenge that I think all presidents face, but you certainly understand, and that is this, you at the intersection of really many, many different constituencies
Yes.
who see higher education in very different ways, who have different political interests and different cultural ways of making decisions and understanding the world. And in the best of times, they can coexist. They're divergent, but, and in the worst of times, they really collide and outright oppose.
Right.
And I would argue that there's an increase, unless we just take the two that are the most visible, boards and faculty. The nationally, board activism is increasing, and one sees that no matter what public institution you look at, whether you're looking at UNC or Texas or Mississippi most recently, and we could just keep going on, Wisconsin, and because it's also governors and legislators. So you've got this group, and then you have on the other side increasing activism on the part of faculty. The number of votes of no confidence across the country has gone up. I mean, the Chronicle's writing about this all the time. You have seen on the one hand activism on the board. Happily, you've seen actually votes of confidence from your faculty. But the president sits there, and I have said to students sometimes that I think the president's almost like somebody with a gun at each temple. That if you do, sorry about this, but if you do something one way, the boards, if you sort of bow to the pressure of the faculty, whether it be pace or certain kinds of, the board is upset, but if you go the way the board wants, the faculty is upset. How does one possibly navigate that? Because both constituencies matter hugely.
Yeah.
How do you do that?
Well, I want to talk about two parts of that question. So I do want to talk about the board-faculty interaction, but I also want to go back and talk about partisan politics, too.
Okay.
Okay, but let me start with the board-faculty interaction. We face an issue at the University of Virginia that many universities face. I am a demographer by training, and so I saw it as soon as I got there. We have a pretty old faculty, and a lot of them will reach retirement at the same time. When we admitted women in the early 1970s, we also desegregated, and instead of taking away any seats from white males, the university expanded, and so they hired more faculty. Many of those faculties have spent their whole career at the university. They're all now ready to retire at the same time. And so in the next 7 to 10 years, we'll see up to 50% of our faculty leave. It was important for me to explain this to the board because I wanted them to understand what a generational turnover in the faculty meant for the future of the university. Sure. So I was not talking here in terms of faculty activism versus board activism. I was talking about the future of the institution, which is above all what the board needs to worry about, and the centrality of the faculty to that future. Now, there were some board members who pushed back and said, are we really going to need faculty in the future? And one of the things we learned in our strategic planning process was, yes, that to our alumni and to parents, nothing was more important than the possibility for their student to interact with faculty members. Yes, it is possible you could beam a MOOC into the classroom with some professor at another university. Yes, it is possible we could develop teaching robots. But that's not really why parents are sending their children to the University of Virginia. So, in a way, I think I depersonalized the conflict by making it more structural. And so then it was not a matter of I don't like what this faculty member teaches or I don't like what this faculty member says. It was instead thinking more generally about the issue of we have to move forward, and in doing it, we have to hire a lot of faculty. Now, then obviously, because the board cares about resources, that introduced a number of other conversations, but those were highly appropriate conversations. With the faculty, I had a different issue. They didn't know who the board was. The board was this nameless, faceless monolith, and the faculty were kind of repeating shibboleths to each other about the corporatization of the university and so on, and they didn't really know what they were talking about. I gave a lecture, in fact, at the university called The 10 Ways in Which Universities Are Different from Corporations. Because I thought it was really important for people to understand the differences, that the fact that many of our board members came from business did not mean they were turning the university into a corporation. But one of the things that the Faculty Senate began, and which the board was willing to do, was to begin to have a number of conversations with each other informally. Sometimes this was dinner after a board meeting. The board agreed to put a consulting faculty member on every committee. And we looked for board members who had expertise in that area. So, for example, on the audit committee, we have somebody from our School of Commerce who is an expert in this.
And is this recent?
Yes, this is recent, yes. But these kinds of interactions between board and faculty, I think, have helped to close the gap. And at its board meeting last month, our board voted to add a non-voting faculty member to the board. We have been, I think, the only public institution in Virginia that did not have a faculty member on the board. So this is really a huge step forward to bridging over that gulf. Now the other issue as to the partisan politics. In a public university, you can't ignore that. And one of the truths of Virginia is that we are a purple state. And that means that it is very important for me to be seen as civically engaged but nonpartisan. So in my first month, I drove with one of my staff members all over the Commonwealth to visit both Democratic and Republican legislative leaders in their home office. And it's important to go to the home office. When I first began doing this, I kept wondering why the representative would say to me, let's go and have lunch together. I have this great place I want to introduce you to. And then we would walk across the town square to the restaurant. Then when I got to the restaurant, I found out there were lots of people there to take pictures and so on. It was because this was a photo op.
Yes.
For the, yeah. I hadn't realized that
They
would be
wanted
the
to be
case.
seen with you.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes.
But both Republicans and Democrats got seen with me, and I also got to hear what they were worried about, what they were being pressured by their constituents about. That was really important to me. And so I learned from some representatives who were far from Charlottesville, you know, my constituents don't think the University of Virginia makes any difference. You know, you're too far away, you don't take any of our kids, they don't do well enough in high school, and so you're just irrelevant to us. Why should I vote for an appropriation for you? So what we created was a document we send to every legislator every year, which shows how many of your constituents are enrolled, how many are alumni, how many patients we have treated from your district in our hospital, and how much financial aid has gone to students from your district. And this has changed the minds of a lot of legislators who have decided that maybe we are relevant. But I think the importance of beginning that conversation was you don't do it in the heat of the legislative session. You do it in the home office. You don't pick one party over the other. You spend a lot of time listening. And then you can respond to what they're really worried about. And I have found that in every legislative session, I've had very productive conversations with legislators behind closed doors. We've often been able to work out a compromise, even on legislation that originally looked terrible for us.
And when you talk with legislators, is that discoverable? What about your notes? You're talking about living in the the public eye. We
Right.
were sitting in the conference room beforehand, and President Sullivan wrote a note down, and she said, now the difference of my presidency versus the presidency of Harvard is what she had written down on her notepad at Harvard for the president of Harvard was hers. And what you wrote down on the notepad as a president of the University of Virginia was subject to open record laws, could be discoverable.
Yeah.
Hugely different.
Right.
So what about these meetings? These are all, you are able to have these conversations.
Right. And I've developed a really good memory.
I bet you have, not to write things down. Now let me take you to that what you talked about, the challenges that you don't know are coming.
Yes.
And there have been a lot of those.
Right.
As you know, there was a Fortune magazine piece that called you the unluckiest president in America.
Right.
I mean, certainly you would have liked to know when you started in 2010 that you were going to be commended for something, have some distinction, but that wouldn't have been the one you would have chosen.
I think I will have a legacy at Virginia that goes beyond being unlucky.
I know you will. I know you will. But let me ask you, yesterday I was talking with the president of a small private liberal arts college who's been a president for about 15 years and is retiring. And he said that in his experience over the 15 years, one of the most remarkable changes was the number and nature of student life crises. And that just really had accelerated and gotten and worsened in all ways. What should a president do, and what can a president do about those?
So one of the things to remember, first of all, is that and let me just say, we enroll mostly traditional age students. So these 18-year-olds do not come to us without having been immersed in a larger culture first. And that is a culture that glorifies misogynistic lyrics and rap music, that is often has deeply racist and nativist strains to it, that is hyper-polarized in terms of political issues. And we can't separate our students from the fact that that's the culture they come from. We can try to influence them by talking about some of those issues while they're there. And we can also try to emphasize what our own culture is at Virginia. I will say that I think we're very fortunate at the University of Virginia that there is a long-standing culture of civility, even though students may disagree with one another. A recent survey of our student body showed it was 1/3 Republican, 1/3 Democratic, 1/3 independent. So there's plenty of room for everybody to disagree. But there is also a conscious effort in the classroom and elsewhere to model how you can have these disagreements without becoming personally disagreeable to each other. Mm-hmm. That is not what they see being modeled on the talk shows, on talk radio, even in newspaper columns. So we are fighting a larger culture. Parenting practices have also changed. People used to talk to me about helicopter parents. Now they talk about Velcro parents. You know, these are the parents who just can't get to let go of their student. And so these parents are horrified to hear about FERPA and other such rules, HIPAA, because they want to know every little thing about their student, and we often have to say, I'm sorry, I just can't tell you that without a release from your student. And many of these students are struggling to establish their independence, and so one of the problems we deal with is the conflict between the student and parent. Yeah. But there are also lots of other issues that we end up dealing with. You know, 1/3 of our students come to us already taking a prescription medication, and many of those are already psychoactive drugs of various sorts. They've been dealing with issues of depression. Half our students drink when they come to us. Some of them are already budding alcoholics. These are all issues that we will end up dealing with. And some of our student life people have said to me that they think the current generation of students is less resilient than students they've seen in the past, because many of the students who come to us have literally never failed at anything. I often make light of this on opening weekend, and I say to the parents, you know, 90% of your students were in the top 10% of their graduating class, but only 10% of them will be in the top 10% of the graduating class at UVA. But one of the reasons I do this is that I want to get the parents to take some of the pressure off, so that these students don't feel that they have failed their family if they come in with a B in a course. So, you know, there are issues like this I deal with. I have, by the way, 15 first-year advisees, and I've just finished advising for the fall semester. And I had one student who was with me for almost an hour talking about the fact that he was afraid he was going to get a B+ in macroeconomics. And, you know, he's had nothing but A's for, I don't know, ever since kindergarten. And I said to him, so, like, let's talk about what happens if you get a B+ in macroeconomics. Are you going to be living under a bridge? Well, no. Are your parents going to disinherit you? Well, no. So we tried to get a little realistic about what it might mean really to get a B+ in a course. But I'm doing that with an 18-year-old, and that signals to me a certain lack of resilience about what they're ready to cope with and how much adversity they've had to overcome before in their lives.
So what can a president do from your role? You mentioned that there are lots of times that you want to turn things over to other people, but what is uniquely yours? I mean, there's the statement, you've probably heard it, that a president should only do those things that only a president can do.
Right.
So what can only a president do in regards to the kind of issues that you're talking about?
Well, I do think in terms of communication with parents that I am the voice they are most likely to hear. Mm-hmm. The vice president for student affairs may say the same thing, the dean of students may say the same thing, but my voice, I think, sometimes gets through the clutter. And so I do communicate with parents on a pretty frequent basis, and I'll tell you, they always tell me when I go to events how much they appreciate the communication. Mm-hmm. Because I know they want to hear about their students, but I want to frame it in a bigger context. And, you know, that might be the context of your student may bring a B home, it's not the end of the world, or sometimes it's the context of we're now facing midterms and your first-year students haven't gone through that before, and this may be especially stressful. Whatever it is. But there are some communications that I think come best from the president. And that's also true of some messages to the student body.
What about you referred to the events of the Rolling Stone, and you live in a world now with social media that just takes off. I mean,
Right.
We used to have a time where you could frame the talk you were going
Sure.
to give to presidents. An event happens on the campus, and I remember this well, even in the beginning of the New Presidents Program, we'd talk about what was going to be the press release to let people know about the event that happened. This is not today.
Right.
So how do you lead in the middle of that when the rumors, the facts, which may or not be the facts, are out there? Again, you as president in the midst of this maelstrom, how do you do that?
I mean, so the press release is now an archival document. You understand that?
That's right. That's right.
Well, a good example was the arrest of the young black male that I mentioned. And so I get up around 6 in the morning, and I was looking at my email, and here is a message from a student saying, what are you going to do about this? And attached to it is this photograph of our student lying on the ground bleeding with an officer obviously seeking to arrest him. And I'm looking at the officer and I'm thinking, who is this? Because the patch is not our university police, and it's not the Charlottesville police. And I can't figure out who's even doing the arrest.
And this is the first you've heard of it.
And this is the first I've heard about it. And so this was a little after 6 a.m. and the email was dated 2 a.m. and I'm actually not up at 2 a.m. So I didn't really know what had happened. So my first email was to the chief of police.
Yeah.
I said, what's going on here? Who is this? And he emailed back, I couldn't figure out which officer this was either. We now believe it's ABC, the Alcohol Beverage Control Commission. And as it happened that morning, I was having a meeting with both police chiefs, Charlottesville and our university police. And so I had a chance to talk with both of them about this. My next call was to the governor. And I said to the governor, I think this needs to be investigated. It was not our police. It was not the Charlottesville police. I don't think you should have to get stitches from being arrested. And I just request that this investigation not be done by ABC of itself, but somebody else do the investigation.
And was this already out in the news?
It was getting out in the news, principally through social media eventually, but by 11 o'clock the satellite trucks were arriving.
Sure.
And so, I do believe that I got out in front of it. There were certainly alumni who criticized me because they said, I took sides too quickly. But asking for an investigation is the opposite of taking sides. That's actually trying to find out what happened. And that is the posture that I put the university in. But yes, I had to act quickly because this thing was obviously going to go viral very quickly. It goes into a narrative which is unfortunately all too common right now in the United States about young black males receiving treatment at the hands of law enforcement that appears to be undeserved. And so it goes along with Ferguson and Staten Island and Trayvon Martin and, the rest of that litany. And not surprisingly, a lot of our students got very angry very fast.
Sure. Sure. Now, you mentioned 6 a.m. getting this email. You and I were talking about your schedule, that it's 7 days a week, unrelenting. I mean, and you said actually the weekends are a better time to work. So, it's evenings every night.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's going to all sports events, which is, of course, recreational and could be fun, but it's work for you.
Right. So it's fun, too.
And it's been one crisis after another.
Yes.
You talk about resilience of students.
Yeah.
Terry, how do you do that? How do you stay resilient?
Right. Well, that's a fair question. And I think it's one, a new president really almost needs to have a resilience plan when you go in for thinking about how you're going to handle it. I remember at the leadership conference you said that we should have 1 day a week, 1 weekend a month, 1 month a year. Ha.
That was actually a president who said that.
Doesn't work out that way.
Yeah, that's right.
And one of the reasons weekends are so important is that's when your alumni come back. And so they come back for various alumni boards and advisory boards and foundations. We're blessed to have 27 foundations at the university, all of which meet twice a year, always on the weekends.
And you, of course, have to be at every one of those.
Well, I don't have to go to every one, but I need to make pretty frequent appearances. The Alumni Association and its various groups have meetings. We have a reunion this weekend of our Black alumni, which is a very popular, very large event. So weekends are always full. And athletics is important. So we're Division I, we're an ACC team. When I arrived, I changed the reporting line of the athletic director to report to me, because since we're expected to have presidential control of athletics, I felt the best way to demonstrate that was that this person was a direct report. But what I've discovered is that every varsity sport has its own constituency. And so the people who go to wrestling matches are not the people who go to swimming meets, and they're not the people who go to softball games, and so on. And so I meet different alumni in different settings, and that's very good because they're all stakeholders and they have different interests and concerns. I can find this out by going and talking with the crowd. So I do. I spend a fair amount of time doing that. But as I say, I also enjoy that. But that's not all. Yesterday I went to the exhibit of the graduating fourth years in the studio art. I go to most of the plays that are put on from the drama department. There are just a lot of places that a president, I think, needs to be visible. If you view some of this as recreational, it makes it a lot easier. So my husband and I both enjoy theater. It's very enjoyable for us to go to the drama. You must make some time for yourself. And, for me, it's that first hour in the morning, and then I cut off everything electronic at 9 o'clock at night so I can go to sleep. And getting sleep is absolutely critical. For different people, it consists of different things. My husband is maybe the most mentally stable person in the world. And so he always keeps me on an even keel. And that's very helpful. I will also just say candidly that I can't imagine having done the job while my children were still at home. My children are adults now. And so, I do think that adding in childcare on top of everything else would be more than I at least can figure out how to manage. And I'm sorry to say that, but it's just true.
Now, we want to get you involved, and let me suggest a plan for doing this. It's a little bit different than just going, one person speaking. I actually saw Howard Gardner do this the other day, and I thought it was brilliant. Howard Gardner is brilliant, but this was one of the many ways in which he's brilliant. And what he did was he got several questions, and then we got a chance to answer several questions at once. And why it worked so well. There are several things. One, it made people step away from the mic to give their question, ask it quickly, and then move on. But above all, when you got 3 questions, the guests could have a chance of seeing if there were threads among them and answering them collectively. It really worked nicely. So I want to try this. If you have a question, go to the 2 mics. We'll go here, here, and here. We'll get 3 questions. When you ask your question, then sit down. And we'll get those 3 questions, and then we'll keep track of them. And President Sullivan will answer them. So we're going to get you moving to the mics if you have questions. And if you don't, you can count on me. I've got plenty of them. So I could keep going. So we've got 2 people at one mic here. Is there anyone who wants to go over there for a 3rd question? Okay,
there
good.
goes somebody. Yeah.
Terrific. All right. We'll start with the gentleman in the blue parka. Ask your question, and we'll keep them.
All right. The pseudonym is Jackie, and the trashy Rolling Stones certainly created a crisis. Your immediate reaction, though, to it has raised questions about whether there was guilt assumed until someone was proved innocent, whether there was a form of collective punishment on all fraternities, whether there was vigilante mob action against the fraternities in the immediate aftermath. And the rector at the university immediately apologized to Jackie, but so far I haven't heard any apologies to the young men who were slandered and smeared in this hoax.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. 2nd question, and then we'll take 3rd. See if there's relationship or where they need to be teased out separately.
Thank you so much, President Sullivan. I'm a proud alum, so it's
okay.
it's a pleasure to hear you speak for the first time in person. I think UVA is in the unique position that it's a public institution that also has to compete nationally as one of the premier research university. I'm curious to hear your perspective on what are some of the essential things that are happening at the university or have always happened at the university to maintain both the public mission but also keep it as a top institution nationally.
Okay.
I'm curious about university culture. So I am also a proud alum, and I would argue that UVA is the most idyllic college campus with one of the strongest cultures of any university in the country. That I love, and I'm
Unbiased,
very proud of.
yeah.
But I wonder if there's something ingrained in some of the challenges that we've seen lately related to sort of gender issues and privilege issues and race issues, and that were present when I was on campus too, prior to when you were president, and whether there's a challenge as a president of a university whose culture is so sacred and so ingrained in alumni and board identity. And I love that the pictures my mom had when she went to UVA look almost identical to the pictures of times that I had on campus. But whether we also have to challenge that culture to sort of progress and challenge structures of privilege, and how you balance that issue.
Okay.
3 questions.
All right. Well, let me talk about the issue of balancing public versus national standing first, because I think that's a really important question. By statutory language, well, not statutory, by budgetary language actually, 70% of our undergraduates must be Virginia residents. And so that means that only 30% of our seats are reserved for anybody out of state, either international or other states of the United States. But our graduate programs are not so constrained, and so we tend to be very competitive in our graduate programs across the country. But I think we're also pretty competitive at the undergraduate level, in part because we do have this long-standing commitment to a really excellent education. If you look at enrollment in humanities courses across the country, at most public universities, it has declined sharply. At UVA, it's a flat line. It started out high and it's still high because the caliber of instruction in humanities is so high that students really want to take those courses, and they tell one another, you need to take this class even if it's not your major. So one way you keep that national prominence is by having great research, great scholarship, and faculty members who translate it every day in ways that students find exciting and interesting. And we do take a pass on faculty that other schools would hire because they don't really want to interact with the students. They really just want to spend all their time doing research, and we basically don't hire those people. And that does mean we pass up some good people sometimes. So let me talk a little bit about the issue of the culture and whether it is perhaps a little smug and privileged, and whether that makes it difficult to have change. I think one of the things that I have been active in doing and encouraging is having more conversations about the difficult issues, what I say are the elephants in the room. Can we talk candidly about issues of race, of socioeconomic inequality? Can we talk candidly about, areas where, let's say, religious liberty and gay and lesbian rights might be in conflict with each other? Can we begin to have those discussions with each other without people becoming angry and getting ready to throw glassware? And we've got several programs that I think have been successful at doing that, but it's something I think that we need to expand. I do think that our students embrace these conversations with great enthusiasm. I was talking this morning with our student body president, who's just finished his term, and he told me about staying up until 5 in the morning arguing with a group of his friends about whether the Redskins should be forced to change their name. That's a healthy kind of conversation because it means examining a lot of your assumptions about a lot of things. So then, as to the question about the fraternities, I think it's a really good question. Immediately after the Rolling Stone article came out, there was an attack on the Phi Kappa Psi fraternity. There were rocks thrown. It was potentially endangering to some of the brothers. They were asleep, and a brick came through the window of one who was sleeping by the window. And that group also went on to vandalize my home that night. And there were many threats that there would be other similar actions taken against other Greek houses, because the argument quickly generalized from it's not just Phi Psi, there is a problem with the whole Greek system. And the rhetoric about this became very overheated very quickly. The Phi Kappa Psi house decided to close. And by the way, our dean of students went to them immediately to see if they could help in arranging alternative housing for them. But they closed voluntarily. They gave up their national charter voluntarily, and they gave up their affiliation with the university voluntarily. And in fact, what happened after that to them was really quite terrible, with their parents being called and told their sons were racist. And in some cases with fourth-year students, they were told that they were being removed from employers' interview lists. And I spoke with their advisor, and I said, look, I will call or write to any employer to say that this is unfair. Just give me the names and I will do it. 2.5 weeks later, when the story began to unravel, those employers all called back and reinstated those fourth-year students on their interview list. But anyway, the reaction was so extreme and frightening that the Interfraternity Council canceled all of its social activities that weekend. And that weekend, there was a march of about 400 people up Rugby Avenue, where many of our fraternities are located, not Phi Kappa Psi, but many of the others. And the fraternities also decided not to take registration for Rush. We have Rush in the spring, not in the fall, because they felt that they were under such attack. And so I made the decision to ask the fraternities and sororities to suspend their social activities for the rest of the semester. That amounted to 2 weekends: Thanksgiving weekend, when there's basically nobody at our campus, and the weekend during final exams, when mostly people are studying, and ask them to come back with an amendment to their organization agreement with the university to make their parties safer. I knew, because I had been meeting with IFC officers, that they already had such a plan they were working on. And so this was not a new idea for them. They had been talking about it. And also the IFC president, in an open meeting of our board, was very critical in talking about the culture of the fraternities. And so our board was also placed in a position of, seeming to take some action. This was, in my opinion, very calibrated and limited action. So they couldn't hold social events during the semester break, and they were reinstated before classes began again. Well, the reforms they came forward with were so popular with the students that it immediately began a lot of positive word of mouth. And so some of these reforms were to have sober brothers monitoring parties, and another one was not to have those unidentifiable punches where nobody knows what's in it. And if you were drinking, you had the right to get your beverage in an unopened container, or if it was wine, to watch it being poured from the bottle. These were pretty simple, and they had actually researched these at some other universities as well, so they were also not unprecedented. And the student newspaper editorialized in favor of these reforms. So the result was that when they went ahead and posted registration for Rush, they had the largest number of men ever to come out for Rush. So the animosity towards the Greeks turned almost completely 180 degrees, from what was mob violence to approbation. It was important to me to act the way I did, to step in so we didn't have any of the mob violence. And I will tell you that it was like letting the air out of a balloon. The energy dissipated almost immediately. I have always been very careful to say, you don't blame everybody in an organization, and you don't blame Greek life any more than anyone else, because I've asked every single student organization to look at its agreement with the university to see if there are ways to make their activities safer for their members and for their guests. The level of fear is maybe best understood by the fact that there was an unaffiliated fraternity and an unaffiliated sorority who had no official relationship with the university, who wrote to say to me that they were going to voluntarily suspend their social activities too. And they certainly didn't have to, but it gives you an idea of what the climate was like. Our local alumni council supported what I did because they thought it was important, and they were on the scene. They knew what it was like there. I know it was not popular with some of the national fraternities and sororities, and we heard from them. And one of them said to me, we're afraid that you're setting an example for other schools. we set an example of safe parties for other schools. I'm actually okay with that.
Questions? Grab to the mics. And actually, while she's talking, if we'll get other people up there so we don't take too much time. Let's start, Kiernan.
Hi, President Sullivan, thank you. As you know, the Coach Project here at the Ed School works with provosts and presidents to make the climate for faculty better. We've learned from the ACE and AGB and CIC, other of that alphabet soup that have studied provosts' intentions for coming up for presidency, that a startling proportion of them have no intention to do so. And looking at the news and some of the things that we've discussed today, you might understand why some folks with that intention may need to get their head checked. Can you make a case to provosts or deans, faculty leaders who may be thinking, never in a million years would I want to be president? Can you make a case to them for why anyone should be a president of a public university?
Okay, Lucian.
Thank you very much for coming. You mentioned the erosion of federal and state funding to our higher education institutions, and one potential solution that has been raised at a few flagship institutions has been increased independence of the flagship away from the rest of the state system. I was wondering if you thought this was a viable option at Virginia or in general, and if so, what the implications are for the other public institutions in the state.
Michael, you want to go third?
Perfect. Mine is related, and it's about whether thank you so much, President Sullivan. And it's about if there is any hope for changing the tide of the eroding public funding at all, or if we're going to have to live in that new reality. And also what you mentioned earlier about public opinion, so that going back to your very first example, that we here in the United States understand why the rest of the world would want the type of amazing research universities that we have.
Okay.
Choose your order here.
All right. Well, let me start with the first one. Why would anybody want to ever be a president in a public university? I don't think it's a job you should take on without adequate preparation. I think you do need to have a sense of what the challenges are and the experience with a complicated, large organization, if indeed it's a large university. Because scale brings its own problems with it that are independent of everything else. Not everybody is going to want to do that. And you do have to have a certain tough skin, to do it. Not everybody is going to like what you do. Someone once said to me that if you're an administrator, the first time you've made a decision, you made an enemy. And there is something to say for that. But I think what keeps you going is the sense that you are building something not for yourself, but for the next generation. I'm reminded of the man who was near death who planted a tree. And he knew he would never enjoy the shade from that tree, but he did it because it was a way of speaking to the future. So I think I help speak to the future when I can train the next generation of graduates from UVA. I think that's one of the best ways I can spend my life. So I'm happy to do it, and I very much enjoy doing it. And whatever you hear about the crises and so on, I don't consider myself the unluckiest president in America. I'm one of the luckiest people in the world. I have a job I love, and I love going to it every day. And I feel really blessed and happy that I'm able to have that job. And 98% of the job is really gratifying. So don't be oversold on the crisis part of it. In terms of the erosion of funding versus independence from the system. So in Virginia, we do not have a system. Every school has its own independent board of visitors. But I was the provost of the University of Texas system before I went to Michigan, and so I've had plenty of experience in a system as well. What we do have in Virginia is what we call a system of restructuring. And restructuring meant that universities agreed to take on certain responsibilities and meet certain benchmarks in exchange for greater freedom from some regulatory pressures. And so we have embraced that. We have met our benchmarks every single year. And one of the things it's meant, for example, is that we don't have to go through the state procurement system. And we don't have to get permission from Richmond in things that we used to have to do. So let me give you a great example of this. we hold our big alumni reunions in June. Rains a lot in Virginia in June. And so if it rained, we would rent a tent and put it up for the alumni. That actually violated the state regulation because you're supposed to get permission from Richmond 3 weeks in advance before you put up a temporary structure. Well, 3 weeks in advance, we didn't know if it was going to rain or not. So
That's a problem.
we always ask for forgiveness instead of asking for permission. But more substantially, we run our own health plan for our employees instead of being in the state plan. And because our own doctors collaborate with us and we work with our own health system, our plan costs $8,000 less per employee than the state plan. So that's a way that we have genuinely saved money. And we're able to then turn that money to the advantage of our students instead of taking it from them in the way of tuition. So I do think that universities have areas where if we are given greater independence, we can turn that into greater efficiencies, which means we don't have to raise tuition as much. In terms of reversing the erosion, I think that it's going to vary a lot from state to state. What we see in states that have recovered from 2008 is that in many cases their funding for higher education has also begun to recover. But I do think state legislators are looking for accountability, and they're looking for signs that universities are seeking ways to become more efficient and to adopt, where it's practical, better business models. So as part of our ongoing Affordable Excellence Plan, we are committed this year to finding $12 million in efficiencies at our institution. And, that's a big goal for our chief operating officer, but we're going to set a big goal like that for ourselves every year. Our objective is over 7 years to try and save $100 million, basically in operational costs. And the purpose of doing that is so that more of our money can be spent for students. There's a lot said about the way that administrative ranks have grown relative to faculty. But I can tell you for us that growth is mostly because of regulation. It's because we have to hire people to take care of various forms of state or federal regulation. And I'd rather spend that money on classroom instruction if I could. So as for changing the tide of funding, a big issue is going to be how the American public responds and talks to its legislators. There is a dedicated group of people who don't want more spending going on in education by state legislatures. And there has to be, if other citizens disagree with that, they need to make their voices heard too. Legislators do want to hear from their constituents. And what I discovered in Virginia was that legislators had not heard from their University of Virginia constituents. When they began to hear from them, they began to respond accordingly.
Was there someone who was standing by the mic before? We'll take a last one or two questions here. I can't tell if people are departing or getting to the mic, being polite. Andrea?
Bend this down a little bit. So at the same time that you're talking about becoming more efficient to increase the funding, I'm curious what types of actions UVA might be doing to increase financial aid for low-income students, and also how you're identifying those students within the state.
Sure. Well, that's a great question. Let me talk about identifying them first. So we've identified 80 high schools in Virginia that have the highest number of students on reduced or free lunches. And we are aiming a good bit of outreach work at them. I've written personally to the principals of every one of those high schools, and we've said to them, if you would like to bring students to visit the university and you don't have funding for it, let us know and we will help you with transportation and lunch for your students to come and visit. Because we believe that visiting is really important to starting to envision yourself as being somebody who could be a student there. We have a pretty strong financial aid program. We are need blind, so you're admitted without regard to ability to pay, but we meet 100% of need. If you are a low-income Virginia resident, and we define low income as twice the poverty level, we guarantee that you will leave with no more than $1,000 worth of debt for 4 years. So once you've hit $4,000 in debt, we provide the rest of it to you in institutional aid, or of course whatever you might get in the way of Pell Grants and so on. If you are a middle-income Virginian, and we define that as pretty much up to 4 times the poverty level, although some families with higher income but more children in college perhaps, or more medical expenses will also qualify for that. We have also reduced their loan cap to $14,000 for the 4 years. And so that means that when you leave, you will have a much lower monthly payment that you would have to make. It also means that we're committing ourselves to a lot of institutional aid. We make the same guarantee to out-of-state students, although the loan caps are higher for out-of-state students. This is a pretty good program, and we're going to some effort to advertise it and to make sure that principals, counselors, and the students and their parents know about it. And we've reached out in various ways to do this. We have a group called the Virginia College Advising Corps, made up of our own recent graduates who are then hired to go to school districts to serve as kind of supplementary counselors for the purpose of helping students think about college. You know, for many counselors, the kids who want to go to college don't get their attention because those aren't the problem kids. The problem kids are the ones who are in jail or on drugs or pregnant, and they don't have any time for the kids who want to go to college. But if you're the first in your family to go to college, looking at the FAFSA form is just overwhelmingly difficult. And you don't really know quite what to do. So we deploy this group of our recent graduates to help students like themselves figure out how to go to college. We have also, through some researchers in our Curry School of Education, pioneered a system of text messaging to students so that they remember deadlines and so that they hear from us periodically that, you know, we haven't forgotten about them, we don't want them to forget about us.
And I think one of your faculty, Ben Castleman,
That's right,
is a graduate of this doctoral program.
Yes.
So let me give a shout out. He was just an Inside Higher Ed today. So,
yeah, his
yes,
book, Summer
absolutely.
Melt,
Yes.
you know, talked about an important phenomenon a lot of us didn't realize.
Sure.
We lost students over the summer because they just lost track of deadlines.
I'm going to ask the last question. And
Okay.
It's a huge question, and you've got about a minute to answer it. Because we don't want you to miss your plane. And that is, you look out at this group, and we've got a lot of young professionals, mid-career professionals. You talked about redefining higher education for the 21st century. I think those were your words. What's going to be different for them? What are some of the things that will be different for them as they think about higher education?
Sure. So what the library was to our forebears, the internet will be now. And that means that a lot of materials that we might previously have given to students in print will be providing in alternative forms. That means you can't hide behind a lecture in the classroom. The classroom is going to be something other than a lecture, and if it's not, you're going to be left behind. That means you're going to have to develop what are really higher order teaching skills to be competitive. And by higher order teaching skills, I mean the ability to engage your students in problem solving, in group work, in thinking through creative projects, doing all sorts of things that go well beyond the readings, because the readings and lectures, that's not going to be the heart of the class anymore. That part will be very different. I think the appointments of faculty members will be different. I don't think faculty will be appointed just in one department. I think it'll be very common to see a faculty member have a kind of a matrix level of reporting in which they may be appointed in a department, but also in an interdisciplinary research center. I think that the relationship between research and the rest of what you do is going to become more holistic, in part because the research grants aren't going to be plentiful enough or large enough to let you do nothing but research for a semester. And so your research is going to naturally be more integrated into the rest of your life, which is a good thing for your students, because your students get to watch you do that process of research, and that's how they learn how to get to the frontier of knowledge. It's a little more than a minute.
Well, that was terrific. In fact, the whole thing was terrific, Terry. President Sullivan, it was just a treat to have you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Absolutely.